Hi, you guys. I was actually suddenly cut off, so I'd like to finish up just a couple of slides looking at some additional theories. So just as a touchback point, we just finished talking about Bandura. And so now your book moves on to talking about Kenneth Dodge's theory, or this informational processing model. So Kenneth Dodge formulated a social information processing model, and he used this to actually explain how children come to favor aggressive or non-aggressive solutions to a social problem. So the book gives us an example of this. For example, a peer walks up to you, nudges your work table with his leg and says, "Oops," as he scatters the puzzle you've been working on for a long time. You're actually almost done with the puzzle, right? So you have to quickly take a look at what's taking place. You're assessing the damage, and simultaneously, you're trying to process the information from this incident. Did this peer of yours do it on purpose? Did they not? And we're making this decision, according to Kenneth Dodge, in a rather quick turnaround time, right? And so he proposes this information processing model that we're then using to decide if, in fact, what we have seen, is it aggressive? Did the person intend for the behavior itself to be aggressive? And so Dodge actually says to us that we would have to do a couple of things. Number one, we have to encode the social cues. What was the person's tone? How did they say it? Oops or oops, right? Does that make a difference? The second is interpret those social cues. So what does that oops actually mean? Third, we would need to formulate some sort of social goal. What is it that we're hoping to do or get out of it? Four, we would generate problem-solving strategies. Five, we would evaluate the likely effectiveness of strategies, and then we would select an appropriate response. And then finally, sixth, we enact the response. And so after that, we'll get into this piece here, which is that we're looking at how our peer is evaluating that response. So within that social information processing theory of aggression, our most important characteristic then is what we have called the hostile attribution bias. So in this ambiguous situation, are we looking at the behavior of our peer as being hostile? Was the intent hostile? And in this way, how we process, how we interpret that information is actually what's going to influence whether or not we attribute that person's behavior as being hostile. So according to Dodge, then, in this theory of aggression, children are going to enter all of the social experiences that they've had, and they're going to do this based on past experiences. So we have this storage of stuff, right, within our memory, and then we're kind of going back to that repository, if you will. So how we respond then to this ambiguous situation is going to be based on those interpretations of things that have happened to us before. Dodge did a study looking at this in 1980, and he had 15 aggressive and 15 non-aggressive kids. This was determined by peer nominations. So a classroom determined actually which kids were aggressive and which ones were not. And both peers and teachers did this. Boys in grades 2, 4, and 6 were then exposed to a frustrating, negative outcome that was instigated by this unknown peer who had acted with either a hostile intent, a benign intent, or an ambiguous intent. And then Dodge videotaped the responses of these boys. So when we take a look at this, the results actually indicated to us that both aggressive and non-aggressive boys reacted more aggressively to a hostile intent than to a benign intent. And in that ambiguous situation, it was interpreted as being much more hostile for those children who tended to be a part of that aggressive category than children who were not. How we interpret situations are impactful and they are meaningful based on this line of research. Looking at this in more of kind of a visual format, we're starting to see this kind of square. It's almost a loop. Not only then does research consistently indicate to us that reactive aggressors do over-attribute hostile intent to peers, but by virtue then of their own hostile retaliation, so the behaviors that they then engage in, these same children will have many negative experiences, and this is happening with teachers, with peers, and these teachers and peers dislike them, right, because of the behavior that they're evidencing. But ultimately what's happening is it's reinforcing what these kids are expecting from other people. Well, others are mean to me, right? They're doing this stuff, and this is then interpreting, well, if a behavior happens, of course, the outcome or that behavior from another person is going to be hostile to me. So like Bandura, our social information processing theorists stress that children's behavior responds to provocation and other harm doing depend more on that sort of cognitive interpretation of the situation than the actual amount of harm that's being done to them. So the question becomes, what causes that attribution for hostile intention? And you can kind of see this here. So here are the reasons for attributing that hostile intention. So aggressive kids are provoking a large number of conflicts. They're more likely to be disliked. They're more likely to become targets of aggression. Non-aggressive kids harmed under these ambiguous circumstances then are going to be more likely to retaliate if they perceive the person who's doing the harm as being aggressive. So we're starting to see this cycle, but also the interpretation here again is it matters. Of course, there is a weakness to this theory. It doesn't actually address the issue of how children become aggressive or why they might have these differences in how they're processing events that are taking place. This theory also largely ignores emotion. So we're not even tapping into the emotional component. Olius took this aggression and looked at it in terms of peer victimization or bullying. And Olius in 1984 studied 13 to 16-year-olds he deemed them as toughs, right? So the difference between bullies or victims, right? The toughs versus the whipping boys were the victims. 10% could be described as habitual bullies, that they consistently do it. And what was found in his research is the whipping boys tended to be highly anxious. They had low self-esteem. They typically were socially isolated. Physically, they might have been more weak. They also tended to be afraid to assert themselves or defend themselves or maybe even to fight back. In fact, he then categorized these kids into two kind of categories. Our passive victims, these victims, they rarely fought back. And then our provocative victims. These kids were restless. they were hot-tempered, they were inclined to irritate or tease others, and they were likely, at least, to fight back. But they couldn't sort of control their emotions, right? So this kind of leads you into that bullying section of the chapter. And here, your book kind of goes into talking about, all right, how does that aggression manifest in terms of the interaction between peers, that social interaction in peers, and how that's viewed as either bullying people or being bullied by other people. So I'll leave you with that, and then we can, of course, get further into some of that bullying literature when we meet in person. And or if you have any questions, I'm always happy to touch base with you during those virtual office hours, and we can kind of get into that a little bit further. But I think in terms of this chapter, those theories on aggression are going to be extremely helpful and really important to understand the differences between them, how they're similar, how they're different, and how they kind of work together to kind of paint the picture of a behavior and how we're interpreting it. All right. Hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing you, hopefully virtually, here soon. All right. Have a good one. Bye.